and I'm wondering if you could just sum up, how does this type of change work? What's possible? What sort of change might come from this, integrating this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a big ask. And what to sum it up, where I'm at is I used to think there was this good and evil, and it was here. Basically, it was a fight between the two.
Yeah.
My understanding now is it's not good and evil. It's a force that's here to sharpen us and to help us evolve as we do. And that shadow that I thought was evil is nothing more than an ally that's willing to do what I'm unwilling to do to help me see where I need to change. So if I apply that at the collective level and everything else, yes, there's people doing horrible things and horrible behaviors, but it's because they're in a system. If we remember that Sacramento fire story, they were in a system that created competition and ugly behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
There is the possibility to build a new system together, and it's not one group or one organization. It's those that have those source vision downloads. We as a whole need to support them to bring through these new models. And when we do that, we're going to create the conditions for the best of humanity to show up. And if we
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. For every 10,000 people that use the phrase, "the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible," there are only one or two that actually step up to create something truly new. Erik Lawyer is somebody doing just that in the public sector, the public service sector in a number of cities. Erik Lawyer. All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I'm Dean Walker, and this is early in May of 2020, yet another year-long month in the year of 2020, a year which has already shifted the life on the planet, particularly for the more privileged countries on the planet. I think we've been able to see fundamental changes in so many aspects of life as we've known it. And I think we're just at the beginning of this process. Excuse me. And I'm very pleased to be welcoming a guest whom I've never met before. And this, as those of you who've watched this podcast in the past year in particular, know that this is not a new occurrence. What tends to happen is I have a few guests who like this format and like the show, and are really on the constant prowl for people who would be a strong contribution in one way or another to the conversations here. And Erik Lawyer is no exception. Erik and I have just met a few moments before hitting the record button here, and we were introduced through email from a mutual friend, Clinton Callahan, who is the founder of Possibility Management, many of whose trainers and advanced students and so on have been guests on this show. And we both, Erik and I were both nodding to the fact that we trust Clinton's gut in this implicitly, that he knows a thing or two about talking about possibilities and talking about new ways of being, and has an eye for when there is likely to be a rapport between folks. even if they don't themselves know it when they first meet. So here we are. And so Erik, I know very little about you. I believe that you are from Colorado. And from what I gathered in Clinton's original cryptic email introduction, he mentioned that you've had quite an extensive history in doing the work that you do, having the kind of vision that you have in your life, and that somehow you're sharing some of that extensive history and sounds like sometimes challenging history, that there might be some, not just usefulness, but some value, some, maybe even some beauty to be shared in uh, in us having a conversation. So that's as much as I know to say right now. And the rest is going to come out, is going to just emerge from here. Erik, welcome. And if you wouldn't mind, would you tell us a little bit about what it was that Clinton was pointing at?
Sure. Thank you, Dean. It's an honor to be here. And yeah, I watched one of your interviews. It looks like we've done a few with Clinton. And so I'm seeing what he's been talking about you too, the ability to bring out deeper wisdom. So it's an honor to be here. So for me, let's see. The nutshell version is I spent most of my life, so 25 years in emergency services as a firefighter and paramedic. And 9/11 deeply impacted me. I call it, it's been a moment that's guided my life since September 11th, 2001. Went out there as a firefighter in the weeks following to support however I could. So I saw the darkest, what I consider the darkest part of humanity, and the lightest part too, almost simultaneously. The amazing, goodwill that was shown during that time, and then also the reaction to go to war. And so I was a firm believer in that, and going to war, and then had basically a shadow awakening is what I call it. And that's where it just was literally a moment. Within 24 hours, I went from believing the lies that we'd been told about 9/11 to all of a sudden seeing it and going, oh my God, how could I not see this? And then feeling like I'd just been ripped out, like my whole world had been exploded. And so I went through really dark time, ended up having, as a friend says, it founded me, but Firefighters for 9/11 Truth. So led, a movement to help expose the fire side of 9/11. And then after that had really learned a lot about the shadow, went deep into our collective shadow, then had a spiritual awakening, very dramatic in that too. And it involved a man who remote healed my nephew and who wasn't supposed to survive. It was an incredible experience. And then he met with me, and that's what changed my life forever. He helped me see kind of what's happening, the shift you're talking about, this crisis point and what's needed, and helped me see that I'd agreed to a bigger purpose a long time ago, and that I'd broken my agreement, I'd lost my way. And that was really what opened the door for me to a whole new way of being that I didn't even know existed. So I'll stop there, because it was basically, that's what prepped me for what's unfolded. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I appreciate you stopping, because yes, there, a number of pieces that you mentioned. I imagine we could spend a number of interviews talking about the particular issues that you bring up just in your shadow awakening. From your study of the shadow, which is a particularly strong piece of, kind of like a cornerstone piece of the work that we do here in the Living Resilience, what I call Deep Academy, which is a place in which people can really learn at the level and around the topics that interest them, all of them having to do with being collapse aware. All of them having to do with finding a way to increase our capacities to be more present in the face of larger and larger stressors, which obviously we have no shortage of global scale stressors going on. I am assuming that your awakening around 9/11, and because you have Firefighters for Truth and so on that you mentioned, that there was some sort of insight that you've landed on that um, the usual mainstream government and media narrative about that event and others are not satisfying to you, and you found other truths and other narratives that are stronger and truer for you. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, how would I say it? What I saw, like having the eyes to look back now, I I could see it from day one. I saw it, but I lied to myself the whole time because I knew I wasn't ready, for the collapse that was going to come, because I couldn't handle believing what I saw was already happening in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like a fog, I think, that, came over me and kept me from seeing it.
Right.
So yeah, what I've seen now, like, it's not even in the official narrative. It's like when you say the truth, like my own truth now, if I just looking at the official narrative now, I see it in a whole different way.
Mm-hmm.
They admitted that all the crimes that were committed, they admitted they did the investigation of Tower 7 without physical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, that is a truth.
Yeah.
And so that's where I'm at now. And like I'd say now I'm really have a new relationship with the shadow. I see the service it's providing.
Hmm. Wow, that is, let's put a little post-it note on that right there. I don't know if we'll get there today, but it sounds like we could have some very rich conversations about shadow dynamics, both individual and collective. So thank you
Mm-hmm.
for bringing that. And again, let's just both note it for maybe later today, but hopefully in a later interview as well. Um, I'm curious, with this amount of insight and what sounds like a chain of woke moments in your recent past. I'm curious, where do you find yourself now? How do you see yourself in the world, and um, what sort of frame do you see the world through these days, and what are you up to?
That's um, the frame I see it through is where humanity's been kind of in the adolescent state, and where we've been like throwing the temper tantrums and everything else, and mom and dad are just getting stricter and stricter until we have no choice but to leave the house, being the existing systems that are there right now. So that's kind of the frame I look through. I used to think the shadow, like I said, was my enemy, and I don't see that anymore. And so the work where I'm at right now is I had to go into the collective shadow really deep and learn from insiders and people that were directly involved how it works and how it does what it does from a mechanical level. And then I had my own spiritual awakening, and I had a vision for what I'm here to do. And I call that, it's the Lifestar vision, and I can share that later if you're interested. But that's what's been my guiding vision for the last 9 years now. And so there's elements of the fire service and several different elements that bring this vision together. And so I've done pieces, and we did an event on the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. It was about making the shift from fear to love. It was called Won the Event. So instead of fighting 9/11 truth, through that, I opened to the love side and seeing the bigger picture. But when I started to bring through what I was here to bring through, I just kept hitting wall after wall after wall. And so it just kept bringing me to my knees. And what I had to go through was my own personal shadow awakening. And I dove deep into that, for still doing it all the time, but I really went deep for about 2 years or more without doing anything else on the outside. And I discovered my own core root trauma. That was really what 9/11 for me was it was able to open the door for me to discover the root trauma, which to me is even deeper than 9/11 for each of us as individuals that have those. And so now it took me quite a while to discover that, to be able to remember it. And now I'm doing is here's the simple way. The acronym I use for where I'm at is SACRED. So SA is shadow awareness. So I went through the shadow awareness with 9/11 and myself. And then CR is conscious repatterning. So knowing that everything has been a lie, that I built a matrix, to make me feel more safe in this world. And now that I've, exposed that matrix to myself, I get to choose, how do I repattern? And that's where I'm really at right now, at a foundational level, repatterning. And then the ED of sacred is what I call enlightened disruption. So if I want to be able to enlightenedly disrupt this world, I need to do my shadow awareness and conscious repatterning. So I'm just at the phase where the vision I've been working on is starting to manifest, and I'm still integrating as quickly as I can, I guess would be the way to say it.
Wow, that's a lot too. I appreciate that. I'm trying to remember just before, I love both of these phrases, conscious repatterning and enlightened disruption. You're doing a great job of putting together things that just, as soon as I hear the words, it's like, yes, there's something clear, immediately graspable of how you've named that, or perhaps other people have named it and you've taken it on with whatever it is. They're very clear, like signposts in a map that you're showing us. And so I'd love to hear more about just about any of them. So it sounds like you have taken on your own shadow work, your own deep healing work, and something compelled you. Perhaps it sounded like maybe it started at 9/11. I'm not quite sure, but you obviously have been on a path of deep healing and personal transformation. And I'm still not quite clear. I get that you have been kind of transforming the vehicle, of yourself to face into the challenging times we've got going on. I'm curious, how does that show up in form? Yeah, I know you've got a workshop, a website in formulation. It sounds like you've got quite a project in formulation, and I'm wondering if you could say anything about that.
Yeah, I think having some shared context here, like Clinton, I saw you went through the expand the boxes and those, like helping with the maps and context so it's almost in a way our mind can relax so that we can begin to let in the transmission that needs to land. Mm-hmm. And so some context, I think that would really help is for you to understand what I'm doing is the fire service. So I worked for both Sacramento in California's fire department and Seattle Fire Department. So I spent my last 16 years with Seattle. But in Sacramento, they taught us something that has stayed with me. It hit me in the heart that day when they taught us, and it stayed with me ever since. And the instructor that taught us, it was just one instructor that taught us. He'd really done his research on the history through the department. And what they called it was Sacramento Fire's dirty little secret. And as soon as he said that to me, or to our class, it was like, boom, what is this? And so we were thinking it was a sex scandal. We didn't know what it was. And it turned out when they shared what happened, it was about the Great Fire of Sacramento that killed, I believe it was over 120 people and destroyed half the city. So if we use in this case, if we take fire, I'll help you kind of see where I'm going. If we take fire is a destructive energy force, but it's also a creative energy force. So it's able to, we don't want to get rid of fire and destroy it. Where I'm at now is the shadow is not a force we want to get rid of or that we'll be able to get rid of. It's actually serving a really key role. But when it's out of balance, when we're not in right relationship with it, it becomes a destructive force. So it's able to do the world melting down like we see right now is because it's out of balance. So part of, if we look at that shadow of scarcity, fear, greed, whatever you want to look at it as, it's out of balance. And so what happened in Sacramento was and this was like most of the country at the time. They were an individual fire companies. You've heard the term fire companies. So in the Sacramento city at that time, and this was in the 1800s, they had 8 fire companies. These fire companies were responsible for their own funding, their own recruiting, their own training, their own everything. So, and all the income that would come into them was donations. So they'd have pancake breakfasts and, all kinds of things to try to bring in money. So now apply this to change makers in the world. We're all trying to do this thing. We know that the world needs to change, and we're trying to do our own piece, but we're still in silos. We're not able to work as one team because it hasn't emerged yet. And so the same thing was happening in Sacramento in the 1800s. So they had these independent fire companies. The only way they got money was through donations, and there was one other piece. They got what were the insurance companies years earlier had seen the problem, and they stepped in and they said, we can't afford to pay you all, but what we can afford to do is pay whatever company is the first water on the fire. So not the first to arrive, not the, it's, you could be second or third to arrive, but if your team was more trained, knew where the hydrant was, knew, practice, maintained your equipment, you get in there first, you get the reward. It's the same thing that's happening today with our for-profit companies, with RFPs and those types of things, and our 501c3s. So they're going for grants, and they're trying to get that grant showing that they were, first in, or they have more traction. So that's the way our culture is set up, or society. And what ended up happening in Sacramento, the dirty little secret is, when they arrived, what this public has been told to this day is that it burned down because they didn't have enough resources. They weren't able to get there in time, and they were volunteers, and so it wasn't as effective. That wasn't the truth. The truth was there was 3 companies that arrived almost simultaneously, and they saw the reward on the outside of the building. I mean, they knew this building, and they knew it was a big reward. So even instead of doing their own thing and being in silos, they literally turned on each other, and they fist fought, and they cut each other's hose lines. So they took themselves completely out of the firefight. And then by the time your 4th company, and this still is true today, that if your first 3 companies don't get a knockdown, you're generally going to lose the building or more. And so because they were all out of service, they lost the city. And so what ended up coming from that was the city had to lie in a way. And so I want this to land with people too, that we are demanding truth and all these things, but sometimes, there's a divine order to this. Had they told the city at that time what happened with those firefighters, they would have killed them. It would have been a mob attack to kill these guys that had done this. But they didn't do it from we're here to destroy and all that. They did it from a survival place that was unconscious to them. So what came from this was they knew they had to change, but they didn't know how. And what they did was they took, so a team of small individuals came together, and what they did was they looked at this now and they said, what caused this to happen? So they analyzed the structure, the culture, all kinds of stuff. And they found that there was common elements, that these firefighters, their heart was in firefighting. They wanted to do that, and they wanted to be able to do it more effectively, but they had to pay the bills. So they had to work other jobs, which made this just a part-time kind of gig. And then they found that they all didn't like to do the same kind of things too, which was the admin work, the fundraising, and all those types of things. They wanted to be there to be of service. And so what this small team, this private team, realized was they could create a new model. And what they did was they kept those existing 8 fire companies. They conceptualized it and showed the firefighters and the fire administrators. And they showed, if we put you guys all on the same team, and this container now has shared resources of training and equipment and admin and all those types of things, we can now centralize those services and take that pressure off of you guys. And if and they came up with a minimum salary that these teams needed to be able to quit their other jobs. So what would you need to be able to show up full-time here to become a professional firefighter?
Mm-hmm.
And once they did that, it radically shifted the fire service on the West Coast. It changed everything. And the chief, and I'll finish with this, is they gave us the letter that the chief wrote years later to kind of address the dirty little secret and kind of relieve the guilt with it, and then help people see what was happening. And he never gave away the secret, but what he said in this was, he said, with today's modern efficiencies and effectiveness, you can never imagine where Sacramento Fire was just a few short years ago. And what he said was, there have been instances in the past of this department that would make grown men blush, and that's the secret. And he goes, but I want you to remember something. We were not corrupt. We were not incompetent. If anything, we were following misguided loyalties to their individual companies. And he said, we were in a structure that was nothing more than a reflection of the public mind at the time. So I was like, when I read, I was like, whoa, like this guy, his conscience, like he got
Right.
it, that we were in a competitive structure,
Yeah.
and our behaviors came from that structure, not from us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And it starts to loop back to some of the shadow work that you were talking about. What particularly caught my ear when you first started talking was how you've actually found a way to be allied with your shadow rather than having this adversarial or evil relationship, with it. And that somehow that showed up in my experience of what you just described as the Sacramento dynamic, where this person who taught that piece to all y'all firefighters at that time was able to have a compassionate and a deep understanding of human nature, truly, and to be able to convey that in such a way that it became transformational to you all sitting in the chairs in that session. That's saying something. So I'm understanding that as a remarkable motivation and impactful narrative within public service in Sacramento. Can you draw that thread out into where you are now and what you're up to now?
Yeah, thank you. And so with that context, so if we apply now 9/11 itself was the Great Fire of humanity. So there's the Great Fire of Sacramento that led to this radical shift and transformation. I believe, in what I didn't say in that shift with them, it took 20 years from the Great Fire to the new model being implemented. So which is fascinating to me, that I think we're on the same timeline. So 9/11 was the Great Fire. And what I've noticed in my own journeys and meeting Clinton and a ton of other people is that 9/11 woke them up in a way that I've never seen anything else that has, and helped inform them in their life of realizing the world needs to shift. And that's where a lot of the new systems are being developed from. So if you take that, we have a 9/11 event, that's the Great Fire. What I've been doing with a small team for the last many years now is mapping, tracking, and scanning and seeing who has the pieces for a metaphorical fire department. Because if we look at the fire service, it's an incredible model. Our world is metaphorically burning right now. Why are we not pulling more wisdom from the fire service that's developed over many decades in this modern form that have informed that? So if we were to look at now, how do we create a metaphorical fire department? Well, we have to start in one location. So I am in Boulder, Colorado. Excuse me, after I retired from the fire department, came here, and Spirit kind of led me here, my heart did. And so what we're doing in Boulder now is looking at what are some key organizations that provide essential services. And I think you would get this, is when I look at the change makers in the world that are doing things, they're on their own. They're responsible for getting their own resources, their own, healthcare, their own everything. So it's really, really challenging to show up. Well, how do we create a container that's able to get them the resources and the income and everything that they need so they can fully show up in what they're here to do? Because they're already doing it and they're hamstrung. So how do we work as a unified team to get them what they need so they can more beautifully, redesign this world? And so that's what I'm working on. We call it One Alliance, and the boulder's one boulder. It's the first prototype. So if what the vision, part of the vision I had was, as this happens, we will start identifying communities that are willing to step in a new way, and together as a larger planet or world, we need to focus our resources and get them what they need. And that's what I'll end with is, when it brings tears to my eyes, when I was a firefighter, I felt the most confident and safe and protected, and everyone thinks the crazy risks we take. But the reason I had this grounded, just I could do anything, was because I was in a culture that had each other's backs no matter what, and that we'd gone through hell together, we trained together, and we could respond to anything together. When I unplugged from that, I went into a severe depression. And so what brings tears to my eyes is the firefighters, that system is pretty effective and it's kind of grounded, but people still keep putting the hero eyes on that service. And what I'm here to help do is help the world see that there are change makers that are in the fire and have been for 5, 10, 15 years or longer, that need resources that could radically change this planet for all of us. And instead of just keeping it as these individual things, let's work together to get these people the thing, what they need so they can fully do their job or their mission.
Wow.
Clear? Is that clear?
Well, it is clear. Of course, I've got some really big questions on the horizon here, but I particularly, I'm wanting to personalize what you're saying. I certainly consider myself a change maker, but I don't know how you define that. And I certainly am aware of the all too frequent experience of being very lonely or alone in that process, creating the body of work, or just doing all the different jobs that there are to do to try and keep a body of work afloat and move it forward. And so uh you know I'm predicting, or I'm guessing, that you have a next step to what you're describing, and probably anticipating some of my basic questions, like the first one being, uh, how on earth do we shift the public seeing that could acknowledge uh, these change makers as a worthy population to create this kind of supportive alliance so that they can do their important work? And this is a shift of, if I could find a word from my history and my lineage, it would be that, um, like so many jobs in our world, the job of a change maker, um, or a change agent, if you will, it, it it's prone to being underseen, to not being seen well or at all by people in the workaday world. It's like, who gives a shit? Like a bunch of dreamers, or you got a fancy idea that you want to sell to everybody or something. Everybody's got the kind of used car dealer kind of, or salesman kind of energy around this or that life hack salesman or life coach or like that. So I there's a few things in what I just said. The main question is, how do we have this population of change makers? How do we have them be seen, and how do we create an alliance amongst them?
Those are great questions. So practically, if we look at the fire service, there's a few key elements that make that so tight and the public fall in love with it. The first is there's initiation. It's you're kind of invited in based on how well you've prepared yourself for this mission. And then you go through a training academy. And I got to see the difference between Sacramento and Seattle's. One was what I'd call a conscious initiation, and one was unconscious, meaning the city wouldn't endorse it. So the instructors did it to make sure that the bond happened. But in Seattle, the city's willing to endorse that type of initiation, which is really powerful. So that's a key thing. And then the big thing is the public knows for certain firefighters are there to serve anybody. So it doesn't matter your race, creed, or anything else. They're there. And their current structure, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it has a lot less incentive for corruption. So they're one of the most trusted, and they're in service.
Right.
So yeah, go ahead.
If I could just stop you for a second, you went kind of quickly for me. I'm very interested in that distinction of conscious initiation in terms of the training and induction into the firefighters world in Sacramento versus Seattle. Would you just put a little bit more flesh on the bones of what
Sure.
made the Seattle model a conscious initiation? Could you say a few more words?
Sure. So in Sacramento, the city, the money keepers, for lack of a better term, the accountants and the bean counters, they were really terrified of lawsuits. So they made it very clear that the instructors could not fire any of us firefighters, because it was just too big of a lawsuit opportunity. And they also made it where they couldn't fire, and they also made it where they couldn't do things that would put more pressure on the recruits. So what the instructors did, because there's people that come in through that door initially that don't belong there. They think they might, but then the training and everything else helps the trainer see, and a lot of times the person does. And this is not the job for me. So without the trainers having that right to fire, they had to get creative in what they did to put extreme pressure on the people that they knew needed to be gone. So it put them at greater risk, and it put us all at greater risk because they couldn't single them out. So they would increase stuff for all of us. That was Sacramento. They did an amazing job in a lot of ways. So I got to see, what worked and what didn't in both of them. For Seattle, what they did and what I was impressed with, what brought me to Seattle, was they had the highest save rate in the nation for cardiac arrest. So they stood out so high. They were 6 times the national save rate. So I saw that they did things differently, but I didn't know. And that's why I went there, was to learn. One of the things they have, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, conscious versus not conscious, is on the form in Seattle, when we do certain things in emergency medicine, or rescues or whatever, there's a box. We have protocols that we have to follow, but on their form, there's a box that says gut feel. So we were allowed to deviate from protocols and all those types of things by just by saying, this was my gut telling me this. So in the academy, what they did was they gave the instructors the right to fire. They gave them a process to do it, and it was a very compassionate process, and it was not just out of left field. It was a lot of, this person wasn't blindsided by being fired if they weren't ready for it. But what they really did, that to this day they still do, is what's called, it's not a big secret, but they try to keep it quieter. It's the smoke room. And what this is it's a several week thing. And once a week we do it after we've had enough training. They put us into a room without the normal protective gear. And so it's heavy smoke, and it's hard to breathe. You think you're going to die. But what I see now, what they're doing energetically, is they're looking to see, with your training and what the trust that they've already built as a team, when the shit hits the fan, do you lean in or do you lean out? So if you don't stay in that room and you run out and leave the team, you're fired. You get one chance, but you do that too many times, and the next following weeks, you're fired. So if you can't override your own fears to stay as a team, knowing that you have to work together through this, then that's what it's identifying. So it does it in a way that's not as dangerous as what I saw happen in Sacramento, but it's way more effective in identifying those people who aren't really made for this at that time. And some come back later and they do amazing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's rare that I hear the distinctions of initiation in any way, shape, or form in our world, and particularly I don't hear it in terms of public agencies and that sort of thing. Um, so you got my attention in terms of that you even see it that way, and then to take it to the next level, having the distinction between conscious and unconscious initiation. This is a particularly strong set of distinctions that I've been very, very into for a long time. And this is another one of those topics that gets almost no airtime outside of this tiny population who understands what is this thing called initiation, because it just doesn't exist in any kind of scale in the industrialized world, and particularly not in the USA. And so I'm really appreciating that you brought it up, and I'm particularly appreciating that you have that distinction, conscious versus unconscious. Is there more you wanted to say about that?
No, I think that landed. So it's when you bring it back to flesh and bones of here, what we're doing, we're creating a pilot project in Boulder. It's unfolding right now, and we have membranes. So it's like we don't want to be exclusive and say nobody can be part of this, but we want to have membranes of safety. Like you wouldn't bring a volunteer that wants to show up and help, say the fire service, say 9/11. A lot of people showed up wanting to help. You're not going to put those brand new people in the middle of the pile and say, go have at it.
Right.
Because you're going to kill that person or others that are, that disrupts what's happening. So you need membranes, and you have the people with the appropriate level of initiations and training and capacity at their appropriate level. And in the fire service, we call that self-limiting. So you have to be self-limiting, because if you're not, you put everyone else at risk.
Yeah. So help me out here, because you keep going back to the framing of fire, Seattle, Sacramento. These are quite a while ago for you, and really now a past career. So who are you working with, and what are the fields that you're starting to reach into with this proposed alliance?
So for the alliance level, meaning worldwide, I've been working with groups that do synchronized moments, that do that have smaller communities that are really into the resonance practices. So if we apply this to fire, you see we have ground troops and we have air troops. We have the fire bombers that can drop water. If those two aren't coordinating, there can be a big mess. So what I'm doing is working with alliance members, worldwide ones, that have the infrastructure already built of teams that are able to stay in coherence and do that type of thing. And then from a Boulder level, what we're in, where our headquarters is right now, we're using the fire system. So it's called the incident command system.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interoperable kind of plug and play framework. We're adapting that. We call it the unified coordination system. So in the ICS system, if we see that the world's disasters are increasing, we as the population need to actually learn how to respond to this in a much more effective way. So there's key elements that make this work. One of them is in that system, when you're building up a team to respond to, so we call it emerge and see. So when something emerges and we can see it, we have to have the capacity to respond quickly. So we're at the early phase of training these teams here in Boulder. So we're in the first step in setting up ICS is creating, they call it a command post, we call ours a coordination post. So we have a physical building that has gifted us this, basically the entire building right now because of COVID. So we're at the heart of Boulder. So we're right across the park from the farmer's market. We're right on the river, or the creek, Boulder Creek, and it's right in the heart of Boulder. So what this is becoming is it's a logistics, admin, and distribution center. So what we're looking at is going, okay, the existing systems are reaching their end, their capacity. We can no longer sustain ourselves with big pharma, big food, and all that. We need to come back to a localized model, but this localized model needs to be interoperative for us to have the capacity to do what we're doing worldwide. So what we're starting with here is what we call the essentials for thriving. So what is it that a person needs to be able to thrive? And, it's beyond organic food, it's living water, it's those types of things. It's not the bare minimums. So what we're doing is we're responding to what's emerging. And what's emerging right now, first, is gardens, locally produced food. Because in Boulder right now, in all of the Boulder County area, less than 2% of our food is grown anywhere local. So it's one of the lowest. It's incredible. So if that food supply cuts off, like could happen at any moment, then we're out of food and you're going to have riots and everything else. So first thing we're focused on is getting the food production locally up. So we have some teams coming together now. It's pretty incredible to watch just how it's organic. It's not quickly, it's organic and it's in right timing. But teams that are now planning or growing mini starts, they're prepping sites of some large scale, mini acres. They're getting those ready to take in the new seedlings. So it's basically we're creating a garden response team that's going to be building or is already starting community gardens. So there's going to be 2 levels of that. And so it's like what I'm doing supporting with is applying fire department coordination systems, culture, and the culture pieces of the fire department, and then the containers to, help people be on the same team, I guess would be the way to say it. And there's one other piece that feels important along with this is what I didn't realize the fire department was so good at until I left. I thought, yeah, they're good at putting out fires, but like we used to say, if we're having to put out fires, we're failing at fire prevention. So we're not intercepting that before it happens.
Yeah.
So what they're really good at though, is they're good at creating organizations on the fly immediately. And what most people don't realize is every fire response or emergency response that's more than 2 units is a completely new organization, because we might be working with multiple fire departments or agencies. So the whole hierarchy, everything changes for that one. But because we're all pre-patterned with a system that works, we're able to create organizations, 200-person organizations in 2 hours versus 2 years, so it's that type of thing. It's like that's what we're doing, is helping these teams. We're not controlling or, doing that. It's providing them with the tools, trainings, and resources so that they can do their job more effectively.
Got it. So this sounds like it's on the ground in both established agencies like emergency responders and newer other kinds of agencies that fill in the gaps where emergency services just don't provide those things. You mentioned about local food as clearly an issue in any town, city, region that is trying to anticipate how to be more resilient. They pretty much have to start at the basics, like food and water. So you're talking about the integration of a number of different kinds of agencies, and having them interact within themselves in varying little clusters in a more efficient way, and perhaps motivated in a different way toward a kind of a collaboration, toward creating a way of producing desired results in the community that haven't been done before, they just hadn't come together with that shared vision before. Is that safe to say?
That's close. It's close to what's happening. I guess it is. One way to think of it is It's as simple as having a shared story.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of what can change everything. So the other stuff can emerge when we can see it as it's not a competition and it's not about this organization or that organization. And a dream I had that I think could help understand what I'm trying to say here is, when I realized kind of what I was here to do with help bring the fire service systems and culture into a new model, the next day I had, or not the next day, that night I had a dream. And in that dream, I'd been hearing the word umbrella and people saying, we need an umbrella type organization that can coordinate and support and all this stuff. And every time I heard that word umbrella, I kept having this like contraction, like, oh, like it almost hurt and it was hard to breathe. And it definitely got my attention. And this was right after my spiritual awakening. So when I was first kind of learning how my body talks to me. And so what ended up happening was I had the dream, and in this dream, I guess I call it my guides or the people, whatever, someone asked me, they said, why are you having that reaction to the word umbrella? And I said, I have no idea. And they said, well, what's an umbrella designed to do? And I was like, oh yeah. And I remembered block rain. And they said, yes. And I was like, oh, sunshades. So sunshades and, umbrellas. And so they said, exactly. And they said, what do you need for organic growth? Water. Like, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what the visual I saw in the dream was basically this umbrella, and all the organizations and people were withering underneath it. So like if we build something that's this monster, massive organization, that's what's going to happen. So what they showed me was they took that umbrella in the dream and they inverted it. And when they inverted it, it became a raised bed. So this container is more invisible to the public. What the public is seeing are the plants and the people and the organizations thriving. So when I talk about alliance, this alliance isn't like coming in as the alliance is here. The alliance is more subtle, and it's there to support the needs of these change makers, individuals and organizations. So what that does then, to answer your question initially, was, or the distinction I should say, is when I show up with only my organization and the resources I have or myself, it's really hard for me to work with you as that same level.
Mm-hmm.
If I've got something where I'm pre-patterned, and because of my patterns and level of engagement, I have access to resources that are shared resources, and you have them too if you're at the same level of service that I am. So now there doesn't need to be a top-down structure that's telling us what to do. We have this team that's already pre-built, like a white label team. And when a source vision lands, and this is another key word, that is when a source vision lands in somebody, and we see as a community that is something that could radically transform our community, we need the capacity to dissolve our walls and support as one team to support that vision, not that person, but what's coming through them. And so that's the distinction, is when we have these patterns, when we have access to shared resources, we now become an unstoppable force, and there's no one telling us what to do. It's our heart and basically the hand waving and energetically of the others that see what we're bringing through is not our ego trying to bring through some project to take over the world, but it's bringing through something that actually can serve humanity at a very deep level.
So I want to kind of confirm that I'm on track with you by telling you just a little bit about some of my own body of work and some of the threads, the distinctions that I'm working on. One that's very current for me is, just to put it in frame, you and I were introduced to one another through Clinton Callahan, who's got this body of work that he's created called possibility management. And I would call that a transformation-based body of work, because that's just kind of the lineage that I came from that resonated as soon as I saw his work. It was a transformation-based lineage. And I would also call his work advanced practices. It's rare in my experience that someone can just walk straight in to that level of work. Usually they're pretty young and flexible and haven't got a whole lot of encasement that they've built up over the years to have to get through. So it's, in any case, I would call that advanced practices. And to distinguish it just a little more, the vast majority of the work that has been available for the collapse aware among us, activists and people who are just concerned about the earth, or, we've called them environmentalists, but what a ridiculous thing to name somebody that, when they're actually concerned about the systems that we are a part of, an intimate part of, that we're thrashing. We're literally killing ourselves and our own habitat. In any case, the entry level work that has really been the only thing that's been available, in my view, for the past 40 years, has been, it's well known around things like the work that reconnects is created by Joanna Macy and her team in small workshops around the world that they've put out for about 40 years now. They're the longest standing entry level offering. There's a relatively new one that's called Deep Adaptation, that I'm a volunteer moderator in their newly formed online forum. And I consider it to be very, very similar, like a next door neighbor to the work that reconnects. There's a certain level of welcoming in people who are new to the topic and trying to get them to feel safe and participate with one another in possibly a slightly different way, and a way in which each person feels safe to express themselves and to hold space for others. And I want to really confirm that what I'm saying is that this entry level work is essential. People need the experience of safety, because there is so much polarization in our world. There's so much just vile vitriol between people, where people are trolled. Greta Thunberg gets trolled in our culture. It's like, are you kidding? So we need these safe entry level circles where people can start to feel like they're not alone. They get practice at holding space for one another and for expressing themselves in an authentic way, and so on. What I'm getting at is that if a person has only that entry level, and they stay there for 5, 10, 20 years, and that's the top end, they're bumping up against the ceiling of, this is as good as it gets, and they try and go out and be an activist to do change work in their own areas of interest, and to bring change to the people that they love. If that's the only tool they've got, the old expression about everything looks like a hammer, looks like a nail if all you've got is a hammer. In a much softer version, this entry level work becomes kind of a glass box with distinct limits, and there becomes less and less possibility for the people who have gotten better at holding space for one another. But there's no new possibility. The kind of new formulations that you and I are talking about, and certainly that Clinton's been talking about for some time, is truly new possibilities, new ways of being. And it keeps seeming like that's the kind of new ways of being and operating and thinking that you're pointing to in whatever the structures end up being in any community where the kind of stuff that you're talking about is wanting to happen. So I know I've been long at this, and let me see if I can just wrap it up in a clear question. It seems to me like what you're pointing at is, I would call an advanced practices level for an engaged community and the engaged agencies within that community that are coming together for this kind of work. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about, from your own experience, is it real for you that there seems to be this kind of more acceptable, easier to understand entry level work? And then is it real for you that there is yet a different level for people to be able to grow into, where truly new things can have a chance to come forth? I hope that's a clear question.
Yeah, I think I'm tracking, and I would say absolutely that's what it is. It's what my own experience I've learned is, we've heard this quote, from Einstein or whatever, that we
Mm-hmm.
can't solve the current problems with the same level of thinking or consciousness that created it. So
Yeah.
to try to get that smaller glass ceiling you're talking about, to try to stay there, isolated and frustrated and everything else, and
Right.
trying to now invent new systems, it's an impossibility. It just cannot happen.
That's exactly in fact, that's the quote that most often I use to give people to kind of map out what I'm trying to talk about. So I appreciate you bringing that up, and that shows me, yeah, we are on a very similar page at this part of the conversation. So how are you planning on exposing folks who might not know anything beyond that entry level to
We
this more transformational advanced practices level? How are you
Right.
doing it?
So what we're doing is we have two, and this is a term I want to land too that I didn't come up with, but some people on our team years ago did, was ESATA, which it's EA is energetic architecture plus social architecture, or not plus, just energetic architecture, social architecture, and technology architecture. So having an awareness that there's three levels of, there's more than that, but there's three that we focus on, of energetic, social, and technology architectures. Most systems and things are built with the social and technology architecture awareness. What they don't understand is how to incorporate energetic architecture. I mean, in simple terms, like the analogy I used, if we are going in to do community gardens on a larger scale across this planet, well, we should also have air support, because there's energies and entities and different things that disrupt and want to do that. Well, if you bring in your water bombers, like we do in the fire service, to soften the target in a way, before, say, there's going to be something happening in a legal battle or whatever, legal confrontation with our protest or with our activist work, we should be having these teams that are able to hold space and send love and do all those things, softening that whole experience. So when this thing comes, the highest opportunity that can only be seen when those rivalry groups are together, now they have a chance. They've got protection in a way that's helping create the conditions for them to see a whole new picture and opportunity together. So like for radical transformation to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have, and we're still in the infancy of this, but we have two membranes right now for the softening that you're talking about. So some people want to be in connection. So that's what we call our Sunday connection service. So the people that are working together have quite a bit of experience with what you're talking about, circling and Clinton's work and other types of works that they've been trained in. And what that connection service is a place to feel safe, to let down our guard and start practicing co-sensing together. And we try to ground it with fire department analogies and things, because the fire service and special forces actually use a lot of these practices. They just don't call them this. They don't know they don't have the same words for it. But it's basically bringing people in to learn how to settle down and sense it together to what's emerging in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
And the analogy I use for this is like, you would never imagine sending brand new people that are considering becoming a firefighter to the scene of a massive multi-block fire and say, oh, just plug in here. Like, we would never take our time to try to train, and you couldn't plug someone in. They have to come through a membrane, and that membrane, this is the longer vision. We're not doing this at this level yet, but I see that membrane as being 3 to 4 month chrysalis, where they're able to unplug from life and go through this repatterning process together. So as that happens, now they can come together as a unified team. the way we're addressing it right now to identify who were those first people to go through that chrysalis, we have that connection day on Sunday, and then we have an action day on Saturday. And what that action day is, a place to practice being in coordinated service together. And where our focus is right now is, like I mentioned before, is on the gardens. So we have more of the professional style, I guess you'd say, teams that meet Tuesdays and Thursdays on the garden stuff. And then more the public that wants to get a taste of what we're doing can come on Saturdays. So, and what we did then do, I'm just kind of revealing some of the how it works, is we want those people, whoever feels called, to be able to show up. And then as we see as a container how they're showing up is when that invitation to the next level would happen. So initially, becoming an explorer, we call it, and a member, anybody can do those. But to our next levels, which are naming for it as regenerators, stewards, and trustees, to those next levels is more of an invitation. It's more like the fire department, where you say, yes, I want to play, and then you're selected also, like based on your level of preparation and engagement. So like those people, that we're designing the system so it's not exclusive, but the only people that are able to come into those deeper levels are the ones that have demonstrated they're showing up and they're willing to do the work on themselves and the container to help it evolve. And then so it is exactly what you described.
Well, there's a lot. And I can feel our time for this particular interview is drawing to a close. And it's always a good sign when I've got a notepad full of notes for, little seedlings for the next conversation and perhaps the next one after that. I definitely have that with you, Erik Lawyer. It's really been extraordinary to have this conversation, and I still have such a. It is so large what you're describing, and involves so many different, encased or ensconced agencies and ways of operating that almost every community certainly in the country has going on. And you're talking about transforming how these agencies operate themselves, and more importantly, how they interact with each other. And I think what you're pointing at also is that it starts to imply some similar transformation in the community itself. So it's big.
As small as we can.
Yeah. So I do hope against hope that this is not our last time talking. It seems like, especially in these times with the COVID, really shadow transformation that's going on right now in ways that are absolutely comprehensive, top to bottom, in our world. So it's probably a pretty darn good time to be having a conversation like this. And I sure am fed by it. And I'm really appreciating the obvious heart and expertise that you're bringing to this. And and I look forward to more conversations. I'm curious if you would do you have a way to wrap up this particular chapter of this conversation? You've been introducing us to your own process and your own growth through these membranes that you've been describing. I'm wondering if you could just wrap this up or sum it up in a way that a person who knows, yeah, we've clearly got systems that need a lot of help at every level of our government, every level of our communities. There's never been a time in any of our lifetimes like this before. And I'm wondering if you could just sum up, how does this type of change work, what's possible? What sort of change might come from this integrating this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a big ask. And what to sum it up, where I'm at is I used to think there was this good and evil, and it was here. Basically, it was a fight between the two.
Yeah.
My understanding now is it's not good and evil. It's a force that's here to sharpen us and to help us evolve as we do. And that shadow that I thought was evil is nothing more than an ally that's willing to do what I'm unwilling to do to help me see where I need to change. So if I apply that at the collective level and everything else, yes, there's people doing horrible things and horrible behaviors, but it's because they're in a system. If we remember that Sacramento fire story, they were in a system that created competition and ugly behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
There is the possibility to build a new system together, and it's not one group or one organization. It's those that have those source vision downloads. We as a whole need to support them to bring through these new models. And when we do that, we're going to create the conditions for the best of humanity to show up. And if we treat it as it's nothing more than my dad, and this is what I'll finish with. My dad helped me see this before he died. He guided me away from the police department. That's where I got hired first, and into the fire department.
Yeah.
And what he let me see, and this I think sums it up here. He said, when you have police or military, they have power over people. When you have power over people, you have corruption and destruction and everything else. Who's the judge? It brings up all kinds of things. He goes, look at firefighters. He said, cops only survive by trusting no one because everyone might be trying to screw them over. Firefighters, their quote common enemy isn't a person. It's an energy, and they're not there to destroy it. They're there to keep it in balance. And the only way firefighters can survive is by trusting each other. So they build their systems and their everything to increase trust between themselves. So that's where I believe we're at. There's those of us that have very key pieces that are needed to create these new models together. And if we can change our story to it's not against anything, we're not here to destroy anybody or any kind of organization, that we're here to get an energy that's out of balance in humanity back into balance, and so that we can all show up fully and in our, in our greatness.
Yeah. That's, wow. That's a fabulous job of summing that up. I really thank you for that. That's like a gold nugget. That's extraordinary, especially when I look at the shape of our world right now, which is every day these days. And I have a pretty big capacity for the collapse of our conversation. Every day these days, I'm having to stretch to whole new levels to accommodate, to just hold what's going on. So the reframing and the shift, the fundamental shift you just described is it's extraordinary. I really appreciate it. Again, Erik Lawyer, I just so appreciate this spontaneous combustion conversation that we've had today. I really look forward to continuing to pull on these threads together, and in future conversations. I'm wondering, is there a way that people can contact you or find out more about the work that you're doing or projects that you're engaged with?
Yeah, we just put up this, we've been kind of in chrysalis, so not public facing. So we just put up an easy landing page as alliance.one. So www.alliance.one. And there's 3 choices, and 2 are for Boulder, people who live in the Boulder area, and 1 is for people who just want updates. So if they go to alliance.one and just click the updates button and fill out that form, then we can keep them informed and engage as, when it's right timing.
Well, I'll of course put that into the show notes today and get this up as soon as I can. And really been a pleasure to meet you, Erik. Thank you so much for sharing about your own path on this journey, and also about the scale, the really awesome scale of what you're wanting to create, and through the alliance that you're talking about. Pleasure to meet you, and I look forward to our future conversations.
You too, Dean. I really appreciate it. I love what you're able to kind of create in the space together. It's fun, and I'd love to do another one of these. And it's an emerging story for all of us. So
Yeah.
Thank you, and I'm glad. Thank you to Clinton too for connecting us.
All right.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.